Okay, should be good. Should be able to see my screen. And if you can't, you can always send me a chat. All right, what I want to talk about today is inventory costing methods. If we go out to our support site and we search for costing methods, inventory cost, average cost, we should see this topic here, inventory costing methods. And everybody can mute me if you haven't muted me. This explains how we keep track of the average cost of items in Total Office Manager. Of course, when you buy things, and you do that by entering a bill or creating an item receipt, when you buy those things, you have to tell the software how much you paid for them. And at that point, the software starts keeping track of the cost of those items. And there's actually many ways to do this. The two popular methods, and we use both of them, are called Perpetual Average Cost and Specific Identification Method Cost, or exact cost. The way the Perpetual Average Cost works is that it perpetually keeps a running tab of how much you're paying for inventory parts. And this applies to inventory parts only. And that's because only an inventory part is being kept on or being tracked on your balance sheet. We'll talk about serialized in a minute. So the software perpetually keeps track of how much you're paying and how many you have, and it works out a simple formula, how much you've paid in total divided by how many you have in stock, and that's your average cost. And like I said, there's other ways to do it, but those aren't very common in the contracting industry, so we haven't bothered with the other ways. Would it be nice to have those other ways? Yes, it would, but we just haven't done it because it's just not a priority. The other method is the specific identification method. That's the term that accountants use. That's the term that you would find on the internet to rent a book. And it's sometimes known as exact cost. And in this case, we're using serialized inventory, and we're looking at the serial number to figure out how much you paid. As you know, when you go to enter an item receipt or a bill, you are required to pick a serial number. And that way, the software knows how much you paid for that serialized item exactly. So it averages out all of the inventory items that you have, but it knows exactly how much you paid for serialized. And that's good because serialized is a huge part of your job costing. When you sell a job, a big part of that job is serialized equipment. It could be 30% of the entire job. When you sell a large job, you really care a lot about your job costing reports being accurate. And the perpetual average cost is quite accurate, but inventory parts usually don't make up a huge part of the job costing report. It's usually labor and serialized. And if you do a good job of entering timesheets and picking the job, as long as you pick the job whenever you enter a timesheet, you should have exact costing for all of your labor. And whenever you enter a bill, as long as you're picking the job for all of your serialized equipment, you should have exact, perfect 100% job costing for your equipment. That really only leaves parts and material. And when it comes to the inventory items, we do a really good job using the perpetual average cost method. And if you look that up on the internet, you'll see that experts consider that to be highly accurate. So that really only leaves materials, things that you don't track, like tape, screws, nuts, small pieces of hardware or wire or fittings. And those usually don't make up a huge part of your job costing. And you typically guess at that, and your guess could be 50% accurate, and you could have really good job costing. So really, job costing all comes down to proper bookkeeping. And proper bookkeeping, of course, means that you're entering a job name, you're picking that job when you create purchase orders, item receipts, bills, etc. And that's really the key to job costing is bookkeeping. There's no secret. And when people say the job costing report is not accurate, it's typically because the bookkeeping wasn't accurate in the software. So they weren't using the software correctly. And that usually explains why the bookkeeping's wrong. So now that we understand a little bit more about how we are tracking these costs, let's look at some finer details. For example, let's take a look at the item history of an inventory part. So we'll go to lists and invoice items, and we'll search for a well-known part, R410 refrigerant. This is Freon. Freon is a trademark name. Refrigerant's the non-trademark name, like Kleenex versus a tissue. And we'll right-click on that item and go to item history. In item history, we're able to see every purchase order and every price that we expected to ever pay. But we can also go to the bills and see what we actually paid. So here you'll see what we actually paid by looking at a list of all the bills. And that way you know what the cost was over time. Now we also have an average cost history, which is extremely handy, and I have never seen this feature in a program, especially on a form. Some programs might have a report like this, but not a form. The average cost history shows us the history of where that average cost has been. So ending October 2010, the average cost was $7 even. And then in July of 2011, the average cost was $0. It was $0 because we didn't have any in stock. It was $0 here because we didn't have any in stock. And you can see ending quantity on hand, they went into a negative number, which is never a good idea. You can see that here. And then finally, we ordered enough to get us into positive territory. And now the ending average cost, ending for June, was $7, $7, $7. And you can see how much this has been costing you on average at the end of every month over history. That's really handy. That's a great feature. So that's where you would go to examine potential problems with your job costing, or not your job costing, with your costing on that item. It's possible you'll find a really large number or a really small number and you'll realize you made a bookkeeping mistake. It's also possible that we have let the inventory count get out of hand. And if we actually have more or less, that would also affect our financials, which means it affects our job costing. So again, job costing, the trick to job costing is good bookkeeping. We have all the tools and features needed for good job costing. It really comes down to just good everyday bookkeeping procedures. So let's say, for example, that the value of this particular item is wrong, that there has been inflation or deflation on this item, or there has been a bookkeeping error that we've discovered. We want to fix the value. We can fix two things about this item. We can fix how many we have on hand. Right now, we supposedly have 807 on hand in all warehouses. In all warehouses. If that's wrong, or the average cost is wrong, or the asset value is wrong. So in other words, the accounting system says that we actually have an asset value of $57.52 for this item. If we decide that it's less because the price has gone down dramatically, or it's more because of inflation, we could adjust that. That's usually the job of an accountant, not a bookkeeper. That helps you understand the difference between a bookkeeper and an accountant. A full charge bookkeeper is like a nurse practitioner at a doctor's office or a hospital. That person might do this work, but a regular, average, everyday bookkeeper would not. So let's say we want to make a change here. We can go up to Company, Inventory Adjustment, and we'll go to the non-serialized item adjustment list and open it. These are all the prior adjustments. We right-click, do new adjustment. First thing we might do is enter a date. So I might enter 01/01/2020. And I want to adjust the value of something. What is it? I'm not going to pick the refrigerant because I don't want to mess it up. I'll pick this one. So we actually have 3 in the main warehouse. And here I have an opportunity to change that to 5 or 10 or 1. Or I can change the value. Right now, the software says there is no value. So apparently, we put this in without assigning a value. And it's possible that we want to fix that. So we could have imported it. We could have entered it by hand. And we put in no value for some reason. And now we want to change the value of that item, which will affect our balance sheet, right? So let's say they have a value of $33. The software looks at how many you have. You have 3, and it divides 33 by 3, and it says that, well, that gives it a unit price, and that's actually cost. But we're on the vendor side of things. So that's actually the cost. So you're about to tell the software, I don't care what you think. I want you to consider the value of this item at $33. And it does the math and says, okay, well, that means that these items cost you $11 each. But in this case, they have a value of $11 each. It will not create a cost of goods sold because you haven't bought anything. It's simply going to create an asset of $33 out of thin air. And you're going to need to pick an account to put that money because, as you remember from prior training, we have a chart of accounts, and that chart of accounts keeps track of everything that we do. Inventory is an other current asset, and I have it right here. And it's warning me that that's an unusual selection. Most of the time, it's a COGS account or an asset account, or pardon me, an expense account or a COGS account. That's okay. We have the right selection here. I might make that message box smarter and consider the value selection and give a different message. But anyway, what we're going to do is we're going to put $33 into the asset account known as inventory. So we're going to debit that account because assets are asked backwards. Debits make them go up. Now, we don't assign it to a job because it doesn't have anything to do with a job. It doesn't really need to be associated with a department. That mainly is to allow you to search and sort and filter this list. In case this list is huge, you could maybe sort it out by department. But you do want a memo because you need to explain this to a future reader. And you might say, found, or we decided to value, to place a value on these items. So you decided to place a value on these items. They have a real value. And you decided for whatever reason you want to get a value on there. Now remember, the date is the date this is affected. So we're going to affect our accounting as of January 1st, 2020. That could be any date. You probably wouldn't want to do it last year because you might have already filed your taxes or prepared your tax returns. So this has financial implications that we have to be careful with. And we shouldn't give just anyone permission for this to use this form. All right, so that's about it. I'm going to hit save and close, and we'll see how our financials were affected. Before I hit save and close, are there any questions on what you've seen so far? All right, I'll take silence as a no. Silence is fine. You don't have to say no. But I just want to make sure I gave you an opportunity before I move on. So we'll hit save and close. And now, there it is. You can see it here. And if I open it, I can't really change much about it. I am allowed to change the account, but nothing else. And there's a little red note down here saying so. All right, so let's go look at that item now. Let's go back to the item, the invoice items list. And let's type in that part number, and it was 00131. And you can mute me if you would, please. Right click, and we'll go to item history. And we'll go to the average cost history. And we can see that the ending asset value was 0. And now, all of a sudden, it's changed. And we have an asset value of $33 as of January 20. Now, you might notice we apparently had some other activity in here already. 22, 22, 22. So there's been some other activity in there. But as of January 20, 2020, we wanted the value to be $33, and we could have said so. It may not make sense. We could have even screwed up our books, but we might have fixed them. This is what a full charge bookkeeper or accounting person has the ability to do. They can go in and fix up the software. Now, we wouldn't do this with a serialized item. We don't have an average cost opportunity to change that on a serialized item. So let's look at a serialized item and just see what that looks like. Let's open up this rooftop unit. I know I have total sold of 32, so we should have some pretty good activity. We'll go to the item history, go to average cost. Now you can see the average cost for this serialized item. That basically means exactly what you paid for it. We're not averaging it out. So it says ending quantity on hand right here, that we know how many we have, ending asset value, same information we saw. But we do know, just so I'm clear here, I think I misspoke. We do know what the average price we're paying is, but we also know the exact. And I don't want there to be any confusion. When you go to sell it, it looks at the exact price you paid. But in this form, it creates an ending average for you to look at. So that way, you can go look and see what the average price is that you've been paying at the end of every month. This could be handy when you go to order it. It's possible that they try to overcharge you or they charge you more than you think. And you could say, On average, I've been paying $4,085.41 for this item. Why are you charging me so much more? So this could be very handy for that as well. Again, if you want to change the value of this item, you want to be careful because changing the value usually means that somebody entered it incorrectly. Let's go see what our options are. We'll go back to inventory adjustment. This is non-serialized items. Here's our serialized item adjustment list. And we'll right click and do add serial number, adjust serial number. Well, I don't want to add a number. Let's do adjust a number. You notice here, I had the ability to select a serialized item and then select the serial number. And I can also move it to a different warehouse if I want to. And I can type in a new value or remove it. So these are my options on a serialized item. I first have to pick the item number, and then it's only going to give me an opportunity to see the serial numbers that are in the system, obviously. And then I have really just three options. I can move the warehouse or move it to a different warehouse. I can also change the value by just typing in a new value. And I also can remove it. So the options for serialized items are a little different, but here, as you can see, you have control over your serialized items as well. So you can fix those issues if you created them. As long as we're here, the add serialized utility, this allows you to add serial numbers to the system and bypass entering bills. The only time you would do this is if you have decided that you want to start tracking serialized inventory and you're playing catch up. So if somebody ever called you and said, we realize we really should have been tracking serialized items. Is there any way to go into an item, an inventory item, and change it to serialized? The answer is no. If you've already been buying them and selling them, you can't do that. But what you could do is you could go ahead and add old to the end of the number. You could inactivate it. And then you could come to this form here. And you could enter in all of the serial numbers for the items you have in stock. And you can tell it what warehouse to put it in. So how would you do it? You pick the item. You enter the serial number. What warehouse do you want it to go to? This one. You should definitely enter a memo and how much is it worth. You could leave the value at 0 if you don't want to affect your financial statements. But probably what you should do is you should go ahead and enter the value. And once you have all the serialized items in there, you could go back and remove the inventory part. So remember, you might have been tracking a water heater as an inventory part and you wish you hadn't. So what you can do is you can add old to the end of the water heater number and inactivate that water heater. And then you can manually, you could add a new serialized item, put in the water heater number, save and close. Then you can go to this form and you can manually enter the serial numbers for those water heaters. And now you've essentially converted them from an inventory part to serialized. And you have one last step. You have to get rid of the inventory parts because you've replaced them with serial numbers. And you would do that through that adjustment that we just looked at. So you would go back to that adjustment form for non-serialized items. You'd find the water heater that you wish you had always tracked as serialized. You'd do a new adjustment on it, and it'd be quantity. So let's find something that we have, maybe have in stock. We can pretend like it's a water heater. I won't spend too much time on that. What you'd find is you'd find the available quantity, and it could be 10 water heaters in the main warehouse. And then the new quantity, you type in 0. So you change it from 10 to 0. And then when you hit save and close, you've removed them. You've gotten rid of them. They're gone. But you've replaced them with a serialized item. And as you know, when you create the serialized item for the first time, it doesn't necessarily mean you have any in stock. So you can create your item, and then you can put those serialized items in there and give them a value. You might also remember this, because we talked about this before, you do have a one-time opportunity to do it here. So when you first create a serialized item, you do have the ability to put in the number of the warehouse, the cost, the date that that cost is affected, and a memo. All right. Now, let's talk about the invoice for a minute so we can see the average cost come into play.
James, let me ask you a question right quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
But the only problem is, so when you delete that non-inventory item, you cannot pull up a history of that. Like, you know how you could like pull up a history of that item to see how it's been selling. You just lose that part of it because the new one, you don't have a history yet when you replaced it.
Yes, but keep in mind you can still look at the history of an inactivated item.
Oh, yeah, you're right. You're right. Okay.
If it's still available. That's all right. And if you add the word old to the item number, it makes it easier to find them too. So, in other words, if this were your item number and you wanted to inactivate it, you would add old to that. And then once you hit save and close, the software will now let you create a new item with that number because it's available now. And if you ever want to go examine this type of work, just search for the word old and you'd be able to find them. Okay. You could also filter by inactive. All right, so let's sell some refrigerant. Let's sell the R410 refrigerant. And let's pick our main warehouse since we have a lot in the main warehouse. And again, you can see how many we have available. We have total quantity of 75. And as of the date of this invoice, we have 75. So what's that about? We've talked about that in the past. This says you have 75 of these, but back when you created this invoice, you had 75. Happened to be the same date. So in other words, it's looking at the date of the invoice in case you're backdating, which people backdate all the time. So we're trying to accommodate people that backdate. We're showing them the cost each right here. So the cost each on average is $7 and a penny. But that's of the transaction date. That's real important. That's why I'm here showing you this. That's as of the transaction date. So let's change the transaction date to the future. And you might have noticed this change down here. It's now $7.12. So Total Office Manager is pretty smart. It has the ability to tell you how many you had back then. It also has the ability to tell you how much they were costing you on average back then. So it's looking at the transaction date to give you better information. Now that's important because when you go to create an invoice, and you give it a forward date or a back date, usually it's a back date, you want your job costing to consider what it costs back then, not today. So the problem with many software programs is when you put in an invoice for today, it just figures today on everything, how many you have today and how much, what your average cost is. But what if you change it to 2 weeks ago? It uses the same info. So when you backdate invoices in most software, they're inaccurate. In our software, we look at what you would have had back then. We're keeping track of what you would have had back then. And that's pretty smart. And the reason why we're able to do that is we're keeping track of the average cost on a daily basis, perpetual. And we're able to give you the ability to go back in time, which is an unusual feature. So just remember, it could come up in tech support, could come up in a demo. People may be trying to figure out why their books are off, or they're different than what they thought, or they're concerned that if they backdate, they'll have troubles. You can just let them know that the software knows how many you had as of the invoice date, and it also knows the cost as of the invoice date, and that's why that's changing when you change the date. All right. Any questions on that part?
No.
All right. So as of 9/5 of 2010, they were free. They didn't cost anything. How can that be? How could they be free? Well, because as of the transaction date, you didn't have any. So if you didn't have any, they don't cost you anything. That's obvious. You'll have people argue about that. You'll have callers argue with that. Oh, I don't care what it says. Of course they cost me money. And this program needs to get fixed. Well, we can't argue with math. If you go back on 9/5 of 2010, you apparently didn't have any of those. So they couldn't cost you anything. So you have to fix your bookkeeping. You've got to go into the bookkeeping and fix it. If you really did have them back then, you've got to fix that. And how would they do that? Well, that's beyond tech support. Tech support's really not supposed to help them fix these problems. We get paid to do that. But you can give them a tip, a clue. You could say, well, the first thing that I would do is I would go into the history of that item. And don't forget, there's usually shortcuts for this stuff. So let's go to the item history. And here we are. And if we were to go back to September 5 of 2010, you can see that you weren't even selling them back then. You didn't even own any back then. If we go to bills, you can see that this item's activity didn't even start till a month later. So if you're telling me that that's inaccurate, then you're missing a bill. You need to go enter a bill for 9/5 of 2010. Or you could do a value adjustment. But you either need to enter a bill because you forgot one, or you need to do a value adjustment and date it 9/5 of 2010. Either way. Now, what did I do, they might ask. That's something you really want to talk to your accountant about. Well, my accountant doesn't understand this stuff. Then hire RA Tax and Accounting to do it. Well, you won't help me? That's because you don't want to do your job? That's the job of an accountant. And you have to let them know politely, but firmly, these are accounting questions. I can show you the form. I can show you what it says and what it does. But when it comes down to what should I do to fix it, I can't give you that advice. The reason why is I don't know all your circumstances. I don't work there on a daily basis, so I don't want to own the decision. If it turns out that my advice was wrong and I work there, it's not a big deal. I could fix it. But in tech support, I don't want to own it. I don't want to own my decisions for the rest of our lives. So I can't give you advice because I don't want to own the advice. And by own it, meaning I have accountability for it. Again, it's fine if I work there. But since I don't work there, I can't give advice because I can't own those actions on a daily basis. And I hope that makes sense. I hope that helps you understand what to say to people. Now, if you ever get in a situation where you want to give them the advice, you feel like you need to, go ahead. I'm going to give you permission to use your own judgment. But just keep in mind, you're going to own it. And that means they may call you forever on things like that or on that particular subject, or they might tell you you are wrong 2 years later. Yeah, you screwed our books up, gave us the wrong advice. You may have gave them the right advice, and they're just uneducated and don't know it. Either way, you own it. So be careful about owning things. You don't want to own it. All right. So that's how you can fix things up. And that's how you can recognize where the state was of that item on the particular transaction, warehouse, cost each. So those are pretty cool features. Now let's talk about a few user problems, and I'll wrap this up because I'm being shorter now. I'm trying to focus on one thing and be shorter on these training sessions so we don't have too much to absorb here. The average cost can get screwed up pretty quickly. Let me close all my windows and let's talk about how. Interesting. Close all didn't close those. Oh, are you sure you want to close without saving? Yeah, okay. Tricked me. All right, so here's commonly what happens with contractors. Contractors will create invoices for things that they don't have. They'll type in today's date, like 27th, and they will come in here and they will find something that they don't have. Maybe sell it out of this warehouse because I don't have any there. And the software will warn them that you are selling something you don't have. And there's a preference, by the way, under items to allow people to sell out of stock. Oh, it's under invoices, rather. Company preference under invoices. Allow selling out of stock. It's in here somewhere in that giant thing of preferences. So usually that should be turned off, but the software will allow you to sell something you don't have. The problem is that if you don't have any of them, then it's not really going to cost you anything to sell it. And that's pretty normal, but people will argue about that. They'll say, oh, it does too cost me money, but if you don't have any, then they don't have a cost. So what they'll do is they'll create the invoice, save and close, and then several days later, it could even be weeks later, they'll enter a bill for that item. And they might even backdate the bill, and they should. So they'll come in here and pick the vendor, and then they'll go backdate the bill. And maybe in real life, it's going to look like something like this. So they actually ordered it on the 25th of January. Actually, it looks like this. Let me do a real one. So probably what happened is they went ahead and created the invoice for something that they went and picked up, and then several days later, they went to enter the bill. So the bill could very well be dated the same as the invoice. The trouble is when the invoice got created, you did not have any. When you went to enter the bill, the invoice has already been saved. And if you enter a bill and pick an item, it isn't going to change the invoices that are already created. And imagine if it did. People will say to us, well, it should. No way. You can't have the software just automatically create invoices that have already been saved, because you may have printed them. You may have collected money. You may have reported your financials to the bank or to the IRS. You can't just have transactions changing. So if you don't enter the bill before the invoice on an item that you don't have, the invoice thinks that that item was free. Now, if the item is in stock, it's not a big deal typically because you're working with averages. But if you don't have any, if you sell an item that you don't have and hit save and close, and then you come back later and enter a bill, even if you backdate the bill to the invoice date or earlier, it isn't going to automatically update those invoices. Does anyone have a question on that? Because that will come up. Okay. You will absolutely get calls on that. If you're in tech support, for sure. If you are an account manager, you could get calls on that too, because they're going to complain about how bad the software is. You might have noticed people have already commented on something like this on blackbeltcontracting.com. They want to know when we're going to fix that bug. And that's just not a bug. It would be nuts to have people backdate transactions, a bill, or anything else. Because remember, where does it stop? An item receipt, bills, credit card charges, adjusting journal entries, you name it. Whatever you go in and backdate, you actually would update invoices that have already been paid, that have already been mailed to people, that people have already signed and agreed to, and all of a sudden those could change potentially. So you can't do that.
James, is this what that you meant when you meant to me the matching principle? Or is it?
Not really.
No. Okay, never mind.
So we do have the ability to deal with this kind of thing. Let me show you how. Let's say that you've been backdating bills all month long because it does happen to companies. I can understand it. They just get behind. They invoice people first, and then they create bills. And that can happen. And maybe they say, well, these are non-stock items. You know, we never want to stock these. So we have this dilemma. All these invoices are wrong because we've been creating invoices first, and we get paid, we get the work done, and then we play catch up on the bills, and they're never in stock because we only buy things when we need them. So how do we fix it? Well, one thing you can do is go back to the invoice and dirty save it, as we call it. So right now, the software knows this invoice is no different than it was when it was opened. And you can do something quite easily. Just type something in and get rid of it. All you have to do is just make any change. And the easiest thing to do is to put something in the internal memo and then get rid of it. Type a letter and backspace over it. And then hit save and close. And what that'll do is that will resave the invoice and potentially fix it. But in the case of an item, it isn't that easy, unfortunately. The item actually has to be removed and put back on. So you would actually have to go grab an item. This is the easiest way to do it. You have to go find an item next to it and then go back to that item. And that's the same thing as deleting it and putting it back on. That's a whole lot easier than deleting it and then go trying to find it. And if you do that, it will look to see what the average cost is as of this date. And it will pick up any bills that have been entered. So it'll know. And then you can hit save and close. And then you'd have to go to the next one. And remember, dirty save works for a lot of things, but not in this case. You can't just put something in the memo and take it away. You actually have to go find the item, delete it, and put it back on. But the easiest way to do that is to select something in front of it or behind it and put it back like that. And you'll have to do it for every one of them. And then hit save and close. That's how you fix them. Now, people complain about that. Understandably, that's a lot of work. But remember, I didn't create that problem. Bookkeeping did. But we gave them a utility to help them out. If they were to go in here at the end of the month, end of the week, end of the day, whatever they want, they could use a filter with a date range, right? They could pick a date range and grab all the month, all the week, all the day, whatever. They could highlight all of them. And then under Actions, there's a relatively new feature called Recalculate Selected. And what that does is that does what I just showed you. It opens up each invoice, it changes the items, changes them to something else, deletes them, puts them back. It goes through that whole process. But it does it automatically. And you hit that. Now, it says to you, this could take a while. It could take, well, in this case, it may take 5 seconds to complete. That's not very long. It's figuring that out. That's dynamic. That value is dynamic, that 5 seconds. It's figuring out basically how many you have that need to be changed. And it's trying to figure out how long that'll take. And then it also is telling you resaving the transactions can change historic financial information reports. Are you sure? Yeah, I'm sure. All right, so it's done. Now, what that did is it updated those and it gave us a report. So it shows us the record number, the item name, the old average, the new average, the cost, the difference, etc. There's the info. So it actually updated all those invoices to take in consideration bills that you might have backdated. Now, this log here, if they close it, they probably will never find it again. So they should save it, print it, do something with it. But that's what that log there is for, to give them an idea of what just happened in case they want that info. All right, so that is something that they would do at the end of each day, the end of each week, the end of each month. When should they do it? Well, whenever they want. It just depends on when they want their reports to be correct. So if you're going to print the income statement out on the 5th of the month, then you'd want to do this at the end of the month, right? This would be one of your ending things you do at the end of each month. It'd be one of your end of month procedures. That's what you would do. So that fixes that issue for people. For the most part, we still get complaints about it, but that for the most part fixes that issue. By the way, it's also possible when you do this, it'll say no action needed. Maybe we need to improve that message box, but notice the title is scan completed. It scanned it first. And what it saw was there was no reason to recalculate it. That's because we already recalculated it, right? So we could go back here and grab some of the ones that we've already recalculated, and it'll tell us the same thing because it realized there's no reason to do it. It knows. It's smart enough to know. Any questions on that? All right. I know this is fairly advanced stuff here. In tech support, it's an absolute no-brainer that you'll need to know this. This will come up for sure, because this is a common bookkeeping problem. People sell things they don't own. They create an invoice, and they enter a bill later. What should they have done? They should have entered the bill first. Well, what if they don't have the bill yet? They should have used the packing slip, and they should have done an item receipt. So if you went and got it, you obviously had a packing slip. Maybe you haven't gotten the bill yet, but you obviously have a packing slip. There's no reason why you can't receive the items and put in the price that you think you're going to pay. Well, I can't do any of that either. I want your program to auto-magically fix everything. Well, then another option is go ahead and enter a bill before you do the invoice. So when you go to create your invoice, enter a bill or enter an item receipt and just take your best guess at it. Well, I don't want to do that either. I don't want to do anything. I want you to do it all for me. That's the American way, isn't it? So the last step is, okay, do it your way, but you're going to have to come back and recalculate these at the end of whatever period you desire. By the way, that is mentioned in the tips part of that help topic. I've closed that help topic, I think, but no, here it is. All right, so under tips, right there, it talks about that. All right, so let me show you one other thing that's related to it, and it says this in the tips too. There is a more powerful version of this utility, this recalc thing. If you go to Tools, Utilities, Database Checkup, Scan. Scan what? What do you want to scan? I want to scan invoices. Okay. You have the ability to filter them or just scan them. Now, one thing this did is it went out and found invoices that have potential problems. And you'll notice that on this sale, the average cost of an item was $0, but now it's $2. The average cost of this one was $35.50. Now it's $36.50. The average cost here was $102. $102.03. Now it's $102.15. How did this happen? Well, somebody's been backdating things. So you do have the ability to fix those. You might carefully cherry pick through these and then resave the invoices. And again, you get the same message box, and it fixed them. And then there's the report. So print that or save that report in case somebody asks about it. So this utility is a little more powerful. It has the ability to play catch up and give you the ability to filter and pick and choose. So again, that's Tools, Database Checkup. Checkup what? Because it scans many different things. Scans invoices, sales, and credits. So that gives you the chance to fix those in another way. And everything we've been doing has been written to the audit trail. Keep that in mind in tech support because people could be messing up their books and it's going to be your fault. So you might want to go in here and look around and see if they've ran the database utility. Had they changed the price of an item? So they might be complaining to you that the item price is now wrong. The average cost is now wrong. You got to prove to me there's no bug. Well, first of all, it's not your obligation to prove there's no bug. You can't prove a negative. So it's not up to us in most cases to prove that we're wrong, or pardon me, to prove that we're right and they're not wrong. So you have to explore with them the various things that would change whatever it is they're concerned with. But I want to repeat that. Your job is not to prove your innocence. So if they tell you something's wrong, if you don't think that's correct, then you have to let them know that they need to look into their books themselves. And you give them some ideas on how to find things, like go to the average cost tab under history, etc. Run this report, look at this, look at that. Go to the audit trail. Look to see where people have adjusted things. They've used the database utility. They've entered items. They've adjusted items. Give them some ideas, and that should be the end of the call. You don't have to sit on the phone with them for an hour trying to prove that the software is innocent of any crime, unless you think it is guilty, because you might suspect that it is a problem. You've heard this before. You've had other people call on it. You know about a bug that was once fixed, or you've long suspected there's a bug and we can't create steps to reproduce it. So you're on it like a dog on a bone. That's okay. But if you don't suspect there's a problem, it is not your job to sit there and prove the software innocent. Okay? So that's really important. All right. Any questions on anything we covered? All right. Just one last reminder. I think I alluded to this earlier, the magic fix. We are going to eventually add a feature to the software so that when you backdate a bill, it will fix up invoices that had that item on it but didn't have any in stock at that time. So we're going to basically create an auto magic feature that allows people to backdate bills, and when they hit save, the bill will have the ability to see what invoices sold that item at a time where there weren't any. It'll compare the dates and fix that invoice automatically. Now, to me, that's way above and beyond. I mean, that's awesome. Sad thing is that isn't going to sell any software. You know, it isn't like Stephanie's going to put that in the brochure. It wouldn't even make sense to anybody. But that's the kind of thing that a marketing company would never bother with. If you're Service Titan, you would never bother with such a thing. That would be nuts. Unless you have a bunch of people really complaining and bad-mouthing you all over the internet, you're never going to do work like that. But that's the kind of work we do, and it's important that we as a company figure out how to get some credit for it. You know, how to get some creed for it. Because we do little things like that all the time. And it really hasn't done a darn thing to build an empire. It's just a matter of pride. All right. So that's all I got for you. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
So when you say that the bill will automatically update the invoice to for the backdated time, now what if they've already sent that invoice to the customer and the customer's already paid it?
It's only going to affect the cost. It will only affect the COGS. So it won't affect any of the retail pricing or payment applications at all.
Okay. I see. So basically the customer won't have to worry about or they won't have to worry about resending the invoice to the customer and acquiring the extra money for that. Like say the item was sold out of stock and the average cost was $0. Then you create the bill and realize, oh, okay, so we need to update that average cost. That's not going to affect their reports or anything like that? Maybe I'm missing.
It won't affect the invoice. It won't affect the invoice because it won't affect retail pricing, but it could affect some reports. Any report that has something to do with financials, cost of goods sold, gross profit, things like that, those will be affected.
Okay. So it's not actually going to update the balance or the amount of the invoice. just affect in the background, basically. Maybe I'm missing.
That's right. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I guess one way to look at it is it's no different than opening the invoice, deleting the item, putting it back on, hitting save and close, or coming into the list and using that scan utility. It just does it each time you save a backdated bill.
Gotcha. Okay.
So best way to think about it is it isn't doing anything different. It just auto magically does it somehow behind the scenes without the user being involved.
Cool.
And when will we get that done? I'm not sure. Probably in the next 2 or 3 months. Our priority has been other things like credit card processing, but we'll get to that. Any other questions? All right. That's all I got for you. No homework. I'd say, though, if you don't understand it, watch the video again or go in and play around on the software, because definitely in tech support, this is super important. But it's also important if you ever want to get to the next level, like if you want to be a trainer, an advisor, a consultant. If you ever wanted to be the kind of person that could walk into a business and be an advisor to them, you would have to know this for sure. I mean, you have to thoroughly understand every bit of it. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.